Hey there. It's time to talk about one of the concepts in AP CompGov that most routinely makes people go, "What? I had no idea." And that is the idea of the resource curse. And in order to set you up to go, "What? I had no idea," what I would like you to do is briefly, on your honor, pause this video and think about this scenario. Imagine that you are the leader, doesn't matter of the political system for these purposes, of a relatively poor country. And somebody has just come in and told you that you are actually, it turns out, sitting on really significant reserves of oil. Pause, please, and just make a list of all the exciting things that you can now do, of all the reasons that your country is suddenly in better shape now that you have this piece of information. So probably one of the things that you said was that this means that you can extract the oil, you can export the oil, you can tax the oil, you can give oil to your people, and the consequence will be that your government will suddenly have a lot more money to spend on cool, fun stuff than it previously did. What that makes your state is a rentier state. A rentier state is a state that gets a considerable portion, there isn't a numerical threshold, but a bunch of money of government revenue from either exporting oil and gas and or leasing its oil and gas revenues or resources to other countries. So if I've found oil deposits in my state, I might set up a national petroleum corporation, I might drill the wells, I might build refineries myself and then sell it and have all that money go directly to the state. Or if I lack the technology, if I believe in privatization, if I lack the capital upfront to invest, I might sign a contract with Shell or ExxonMobil or somebody saying, you can come in and drill our oil and you have to give us 50% of the revenues every year or something like that. The states that are in this position in this course are going to be Russia, Nigeria, and Iran. Those are all the states that get a pretty big chunk of their government budget from oil and gas exports or leases every year. Um, and there's some really fundamental advantages that could accrue to you as the result of your rentier state status. You could, and they generally stem from having access to a bunch of money that your government can dispose of however it wants. In principle, you could invest that money in all kinds of cool stuff. You could buy schools, you could buy puppies for everybody, you could build a nice national railroad network, you could build a beautiful presidential palace with yourself, a statue of yourself in solid gold, whatever you want. And so, in principle, your government has a bunch of money that it can spend on doing cool stuff for the public good or just for your own personal ego, whatever. I'm not here to judge. The alternative, in addition, you could also say that this is potentially a job creating industry, right? Both directly from people who are working in oil and gas extraction and refinement, and indirectly from the people who, sell them lunch while they're at work, and even less directly from the people who benefit from all that government investment that you may or may not be doing. So, in principle, having access to natural resources can be an amazing thing for a country that will increase its overall standard of living. However, there's also some pretty considerable possible disadvantages, and the pattern of countries thinking that they have a huge boon in the form of oil and gas deposits that they nationalize, and then turning out to have massive political and economic problems as a result of exploiting those resources. That pattern is so common that there's a term in the political science and economics literature for when having oil and gas make things go south in your country, and that term is the resource curse. Little over dramatic, but whatever. The resource curse, sometimes you'll see it described as the resource trap or the oil curse or something like that. There's these equivalent terms bouncing around. The resource curse refers to the theory that having natural resources make it harder to achieve economic development and democratization. So again, negative economic impacts and negative political impacts, at least if you subscribe to the theory that democracy is better than authoritarianism, which your textbook authors most certainly do. And in general, especially in particular in this course, this most commonly happens with oil and gas. In principle, I think you could probably have it with if your country had massive deposits of something like diamonds, but all the countries that we care about in this class have oil and gas as their major natural resource. So, why might it be a bad thing to have oil? I have about 17 different reasons for you, and I'll run through them relatively quickly. One possibility is that there's really no reason, if it's easy to make money by exporting or by renting or leasing oil and gas, there's really no incentive for economic diversification or development. In the worst case scenario, your economy starts to become completely dependent on that single natural resource. And so, if we move to that carbon free future that everybody's talking about, or if the oil price crashes, suddenly you don't have a whole lot to fall back on. Related to that is that the government, tends to invest in certain sectors of the economy, and there's a strong, strong temptation in a rentier state to spend all of the government's investment potential in the oil and gas industry, and to neglect other industries and other things that are going to make a broader segment of the population's lives better. A third is that no one country has control over the price of oil. They will sometimes band together. We'll talk a little bit later in this course about OPEC and how it can increase countries' power. But no one country has total control over the price of oil because there's a bunch of different countries selling oil on the world market, and there's nothing particularly special about Nigerian or Iranian oil that makes it better than oil that's drilled in Texas. And so when the oil price falls, a country doesn't have a ton of ways to control that slide in oil prices. And so you might project the people who plan your budget might project having this much money coming in from sales of oil and gas. And if the price crashes, then all of a sudden you're left with a massive deficit. You're left with way less revenue. Conversely, when the oil price goes way higher than you're expecting, that can be a great thing if you spend it wisely, but it can be a bad thing if you take that opportunity to borrow a bunch more money because people are willing to lend to you cheaply, or if you take that opportunity to just spend all your oil revenues on some irresponsible project that you're not actually going to be able to complete once the oil price goes back down again. So having being dependent on a resource whose price is largely beyond your control can have some really obvious problems there. A fourth problem, and my macroeconomics background is too fuzzy to explain this super cogently to you, but a fourth problem is known as Dutch disease because it happens to the Netherlands, which is that when you're exporting oil, a bunch of other countries' currencies are chasing after your currency, and your currency is going to become more valuable on the world market relative to other currencies. This is great for your citizens when they want to go shopping somewhere else because they have more buying power, but it's actually really bad for every other industry in your country that's trying to export anything, that's trying to sell their goods to any other country, because given those exchange rates, it's relatively more expensive for consumers in other countries to buy stuff made in your country. And so if you have a bunch of other countries' currencies chasing after your currency because they need to buy your oil in your currency, that can actually reinforce that pattern of discouraging economic diversification, encouraging over-reliance on the oil sector. And so it can actually be bad for other sectors of your economy. A fifth thing is that oil and gas can lead to massive inequality. If you don't find a way of both diversifying your economy and of redistributing the revenues that come to your government as a result of oil and gas, you're going to get increasing economic inequality. And we've talked already in this course about how economic inequality can be politically destabilizing. And then bleeding into the political stuff, these arguments start to be a little more controversial, but I think they're important to engage with and to think about how they work in our specific case study countries. One argument for the resource curse as a as a negative political phenomenon is that countries, and particularly specifically government actors that have a steady stream of revenue from oil and gas, have no incentive to modernize. They have no incentive to diversify their economy, as we've said, but they also have no incentive to become more democratic. And a big part of the reason why is that they're actually not necessarily reliant. They don't necessarily depend on citizens paying taxes. And so they face less of an incentive to occasionally go back to the citizens and say, hey, you pay us taxes. How do you want this money to be spent? In other words, there's not really a link between whether the government's getting money in its annual revenues and whether the government is doing things that its citizenry wants it to do. So you can make an argument that there's a lot less accountability in a government that has all of these independent revenues from natural resources. Related to that problem is that there is just a massive possibility for corruption. And you'll see this particularly in Nigeria. You'll see some of it in Iran and Russia as well. Just the amount of oil and the amount of power that is kind of flowing around together in any country with really significant natural resources means that you often see just tremendous amounts of corruption, partly because people are competing in sort of non meritocratic ways to get access to control over the oil, partly because oil revenues will give politicians a big, big source of money that they can use to dispense patronage to their supporters instead of actually doing things with the power of the state that are good for all citizens. Um, Finally, I think this is an argument I articulated already. When governments rely less on taxes, citizens don't have as much voice in the decisions of the government. Finally, you see this in countries with oil. We'll talk about it in Nigeria. Some of you will do a panel on it. Alternatively, if you're familiar with the phenomenon of blood diamonds and conflicts over diamond mines in West Africa and Central Africa over the last couple of decades, this might be a familiar argument to you already. Kanye West actually once pretended to do a song about that phenomenon. But if you have natural resources in a particular area of the country, and the citizens of that area of the country, say, feel disenfranchised, one thing that they might do, as is the case in Nigeria sometimes, is to sabotage oil production as a way of expressing their discontent that they don't benefit from this vast national patrimony, despite what's often the negative environmental consequences of living next to a massive oil and gas extraction operation. Sometimes you'll actually see more direct, physical conflict over who gets to drill the oil or who gets to mine the diamonds. And so those of you who are doing the Niger Delta panel will address that issue pretty directly in a week or so. The last thing I want to leave you with is not an exhaustive discussion, but just a couple of policy approaches to consider, because we're going to look at 5 of the 6 case study countries. Every country except the UK gets some amount of revenue from oil extraction and gas extraction in this course, and 3 of those countries, Iran, Nigeria, and Russia, are pretty heavily reliant, are qualified as rentier states. So a couple of different policy approaches that countries will take in an attempt to mitigate the negative effects of the resource curse. Most basically, many countries will nationalize oil and gas. The United Kingdom, which does actually produce some oil off the coast of Scotland, the United Kingdom is the only case study country in this course that hasn't nationalized its oil and gas revenues. The other 5 all have provisions in their constitution or laws that say oil and gas in this country are the property of the state, and they will be extracted and used or rented out for the benefit of the people. Whether or not that's actually true is a slightly different story. So many countries will nationalize oil and gas, at least to some degree. Some countries, and Nigeria is going to be the foremost example here, won't necessarily have the capital or the technology or the expertise to extract and particularly to refine that oil themselves. And so they have to enter into partnerships with multinational corporations. So Shell, for instance, is based in the Netherlands, but does a huge amount of business in Nigeria. And you might make the argument that Shell's importance to the Nigerian economy and to the Nigerian state's budget has given it an amount of political power that's really out of all proportion to what the amount of political power it should actually have in that country. Another option here, slightly overlapping, is that in Mexico, within the last decade, under the Peña Nieto administration, as you know, Pemex, the state-owned oil company, has just recently been allowed to engage in joint ventures with private investors from both inside and outside of Mexico. And so that's a slightly, you could in principle have less dependence on foreign companies, but still allow private investors to get involved in your oil industry in some way, even in the context of a nationalized oil industry. And then, of course, there are countries that will privatize their natural resources altogether, and you might want to be prepared to think through the consequences of doing that in terms of sovereignty, in terms of political stability, in terms of economic equality, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's it. We'll come back to the resource curse when I talk to you next about Nigeria, and we'll revisit it in Russia and in Iran.